Everybody who's read this next book says it just shouldn't work as a book, but it does. The main character, stay with me, is a 13,000-year-old American mammoth whose existence, alive and fossilised, has covered the entire span of humankind. Mammoth Americanum, who goes by the nickname Mammoth, is a pompous, aloof, noble but cynical creature with a dim view of those he calls hominids, humans.
What a boon man is to the world, helpfully clearing away its original inhabitants to make room for their grubby dwellings and mewling spawn. You really have to hand it to them. They've taken a pristine wilderness that spanned the globe and brought it to heel with their concrete and firearms and technology. I wish I had killed more of them.
The book, very much a comic novel, packs a punch with a message about climate change, and it's simply titled Mammoth. And its author, Chris Flynn, joins us on Skype from Phillip Island in Victoria. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Ellen. How are you?
Well, there are piles of unfolded washing around my house. There are unmade lunches. There are things that Productivity Commission reports that I have not read because I have read your book instead. I have to ask you, a mammoth, how did this wonderful mammoth jump into your mind, this wonderful voice?
Well, I read about a natural history auction in 2007 in New York, a real auction that took place where the bones of various megafauna and dinosaurs, other ephemera, were under the hammer. And they were fought over by museums and celebrities such as Leonardo DiCaprio and Nicolas Cage, who both tried to buy a Tyrannosaurus skull. Because
so they were bidding against each other. I want this skull. No, I want this skull. Paddle in the air. All this, yeah.
What the whole thing was that they were wanting it because I guess they want to appropriate a symbol of strength from the animal kingdom to show how macho they are. And I thought this was a funny story, but then when I looked into the history of when the bones had been dug up, the mammoth bones, for example, had been dug up in 1800, and at the behest of President Jefferson, an early Republican president, who wanted them for exactly the same reasons, to show the Europeans what a big, strong nation America was.
So our prehistoric megafauna are better than your prehistoric megafauna. Was that basically the argument? Jefferson.
Exactly. And so they've been doing it for hundreds of years, the Americans. They've got this chip on their shoulder about how strong they are and how great they are. And it struck a chord with me, considering all the current politics. So I thought it'd be interesting for these creatures to tell the story of how they were dug up, who dug them up, why, and what's been happening to them ever since.
So it's set the night before this auction that actually took place. But I still want to understand how this surly and slightly depressive and wonderfully introspective woolly mammoth, verbose, which I can relate to, how did he pop into your head, that voice?
Yeah, that's a tricky one to answer. When I was researching about mammoth bones and going right back to the end of the Ice Age and looking at how our ancestors turned up and basically exterminated these creatures who were serving, quite a sensible purpose in stomping around the earth. There were tens of millions of them, and they would keep the ground nice and cold. And then we killed them all, ate them, and then everything started to get warm.
Right.
So I became fascinated with the idea of this creature had been around for 10, 12,000 years, observing us. And honestly, when I started researching it, I became quite aware of the mammoth sort of looming over my shoulder, watching me do it, waiting to speak. I was quite scared of what would happen whenever I did write it, but once I did, he was right there.
He was right there bellowing at you with disdain.
He was.
And disgust. Tanya Hosh, reflect for me on that idea that so captured Chris's imagination. Nicolas Cage, imagine, bought the bloody thing for $276,000, the skull of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, only to outbidding Leonardo DiCaprio. I mean, can I say pissing contest? Can I say that on television? I think I just did. Like an arms race for old bones. What do you reflect on that desire to own a piece of history as a trophy?
I think if I had the kind of money to buy a piece of history, I'd only do it on the basis that it could be shared with everybody. I think that I don't, I collect jewellery and shoes and things like that. I don't have a desire to collect objects of history, although, I would love to have a beautiful art collection. I think, I've been around people who do own objects of historical significance, and they do seem to treasure them, and they obviously mean something to them. But I certainly feel that we have to remember that history is best shared. Well, at least that's my opinion. Yeah. And for us all to have an opportunity to appreciate that history is part of helping us understand it better. And I think that we perhaps don't value the asset that history is in terms of making sure that we learn the lessons of history. And I think about that with, some of the TV programs that have ceased to be made available. I want to understand and remember history, and I want to understand the legacy and the path of where we've come to where we are, because that in part gives me a great deal of hope that change is possible.
And that's part of what you're trying to do here, Chris, isn't it? But you've created a structural problem for yourself in the book, I would have thought, in that you've had the Mammoth span the whole history of human civilization, and so you're going to have to reflect and write on it. And as I turned each page, I thought, is this man just Googling like a mad thing, or has he read the most obscure series of books in the history of ever to know the beginning of how do you make bourbon, and the supernatural history of the Third Reich, and early man's arrival and women's arrival in Europe? Where'd you get that from?
It was one of those stories that once I started delving into history, I just discovered all these ideas and notions and things that happened, obscure facts, and it became this book of ideas, and I just wanted to share those ideas and my joy in finding them. And honestly, the bones have passed between the hands of many different, usually men, over the years, and I thought this was a very odd journey that these animal bones had gone on, this idea of ownership throughout the centuries, which is not proven to be very good for us as a species. Conquest and slavery, these things don't work out, and our basically need to exert dominion over the natural world. I thought that was a really interesting thing to explore.
And he says in the book at some point, hominids tend to overlook the truth because they are too lazy to bother seeking it themselves. They prefer to be told what to do and what to think. A fatal flaw in their character, this is all of humanity, by the way, which will forever hold them back from reaching their true potential. Is that you, or is that the spirit of the mammoth?
I think the mammoth is speaking through me a little bit there. I have a bit of more of an optimistic view of humanity. I believe in creativity and intelligence and empathy. These are values that will ultimately trump, well, that's the wrong word to use, ultimately prove more powerful than ignorance and stupidity. I may be wrong, but I am one of those rare artists who's an optimist.
Jane Carroll, can I turn to you? Mammoth is actually masquerading as a bit of an activist, right? And he sits there and he talks about climate change, really. But it's done in such a comic way. The Tyrannosaurus Rex, who he's talking to all night before the auction, starts to think about humanity's capacity to destroy the Earth. And it's very funny. He says he didn't used to think that the hominoids were right, but he says, what changed my mind, now this is Tyrannosaurus Rex speaking, what changed my mind was the asteroid. Remember how I told you to watch for those? I cannot stress this point enough. And it seemed to me that I wanted to ask you, what a great place to hide a political idea behind giant megafauna. Fauna. Is that a great idea?
It's a brilliant idea, and in fact, as you've been talking about it, I'm an old English Lit grad. I was thinking about Gulliver's Travels and Jonathan Swift, and he was very much talking about the ugly human creature in that. There were the Brobdingnags, and homonym is similar. So this satirical view, hidden in a kind of almost legendary tale way of doing it, is incredibly clever at communicating a political point of view, and a very pointed one. And I think the point about our planet and the danger it is in remains probably the most important point that needs to be continually communicated whenever anyone gets a chance. Good on you, Grizz.
Chris, can I just ask you a quick final question? That is that some time ago, a very stinky mammoth was dug up. It actually did stink. It was dug out of the ground and it actually oozed blood. Just in 10-15 seconds, is there any prospect that the DNA could be used to recreate this wonderful, grumpy, slightly depressive, introspective creature?
It's not a prospect, it's a reality. There's 3 different teams around the world, synthetic biologists who are working on reviving the mammoth. We might see baby mammoths within a year or 2.
Oh, wow. Wonderful. There you are. A woolly mammoth with an environmental message coming to a planet near you. That is all we have time for. Thanks to our panel, to Scott Yung, Jane Currow, to Tanya Hosh, to Kelly Beebe. Thanks for joining us, and to our guest, Chris Flynn. Have an excellent evening. I'm not Julia Baird. She'll be with you next week. Good night to you.